Hey, before we begin, we want to make one quick note about a last minute change that we made to this podcast that will apply to the first 3 podcasts that we're uploading, including the trailer edition. You will hear us introducing these podcasts, the podcast as the Thinklings podcast. But you will note that we have just decided when you search on it on Apple or Google Podcast or Spotify that we have just made the decision to call it the Drinklings podcast. This was an intentional last-minute decision that we made for several reasons that are a bit complex and varied and probably unnecessary to elaborate on here, but we just want to make that note that when it says the Thinklings podcast, really, we're just changing that name. So hope you enjoy this first official episode.
All right. I was not going to do this without some cold brew. Just for the inaugural episode.
Absolutely. I had to stand down. I'm not jittery yet, but one more cup might have put me over the edge.
Hey, this is Randy Hardman with the inaugural edition of the Drinklings podcast, a podcast really devoted towards looking at imagination, fellowship, and the relationship between those two concepts and coffee. We have on kind of our first podcast here, Matt Luce. He's director. I'll let him kind of introduce himself here in a little bit, but director of the Beehive Collective and also a fellow coffee roaster. I thought that, with starting off this podcast, it would be a great, we could bring in a lot of people, but just thought it would be a great opportunity to bring on a friend, a thoughtful person, a fellow traveler in the whole business world and the business as mission world, somebody who has been involved in coffee sourcing and startup and all that kind of stuff, and just thought it would be a great conversation to talk through all of those different aspects and whatnot. So welcome to the show, Matt.
Right on. Well, thanks, Randy. I didn't realize coming in that this was, we're setting sail on the maiden voyage. So that's a huge honor. I'm stoked to be with you. I think it was a year and a half ago or a little longer that we were together before and recording an episode for a podcast that we have called The Slow Drip. And we're currently in the process of rebooting that. And so this is exciting for me to kind of be back on the mic and get to talk about all kinds of things. Like you said, coffee and the stories that come from behind the coffee, and then, sitting down to have a cup of coffee and what stories come from that as well. It's all just kind of one part of it, but, that idea of like imagination, travel, entrepreneurial mission, business's mission. So I'm kind of mixed into all of those things and just trying to take a crack at whatever. And just by way of introductions, I am the executive director of Beehive Global Collective. It's a crowdfunding nonprofit ministry for missionaries around the world. We got started with that about 4 years ago. And the vision, the impetus was my background being in nonprofit, primarily international missions work throughout my career, and kind of seeing this kind of niche opportunity to say, you know what, there are missionaries globally that need partnering with not necessarily long-term funding or, like you would say, like sponsorship or that kind of thing, like child sponsorship or sustained continual funding, but more of like special project costs. And how do we step in, help cast a net wider to help these missionaries raise funds for specific projects. Currently, we're working with missionaries in Southeast Asia, Bolivia, and northern Kenya, and the kind of sub-Saharan desert of northern Kenya. And it was kind of in the middle of all of that in 2019, the opportunity kind of arose to
pre-COVID times.
Right. Yeah. And
We
COVID
had
time,
no idea what was around the corner.
I'll tell you, that was, yeah. And I've thought about it after the fact. Like, if I had any idea what was coming up next, I don't know if I would have, made the leap or not. But we had an opportunity. One of the missionaries we were working with in Southeast Asia had some contacts with coffee growers, and Southeast Asia is a pretty untapped coffee producing region. Um, it produces some really unique coffee, I feel like. So basically, that kind of whole corridor from Burma, Myanmar, through the mountains, northern Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, all small farm coffee producers. Is kind of, I mean, if you think uh, poppy production, Golden Triangle, um, is that same kind of environment is perfect for coffee. And at least in Thailand, it's one of those things where the government is really kind of subsidizing and saying, look, we're going to encourage you to grow coffee instead of heroin, with the butt of a rifle. And that's your only encouragement. So hop to it. And it's cool to kind of see things kind of take off. I think those initiatives started about 15, 20 years ago, and it's starting to grow from there. So Genesis point for us was for Cisterna Coffee Company as a coffee roasting company. Was kind of there in 2019 in Southeast Asia. Um, God was opening up some crazy doors for us to, say, okay, if this is it, Lord, we're going to keep walking and stepping through doors as you open them. So we raised some capital, bought our first consignment of coffee. And then, pandemic hit, the world shut down, and it was wild because then, we still had coffee was on the boat somewhere in the Pacific. And it's like, what's going to happen when it comes in? We're in
that Thailand coffee that was on the boat right when COVID. Yeah.
We didn't even know if we were ever going to get it after we'd already laid down the cash for it. And again, God opened up some crazy doors. So that's kind of how I got into the coffee roasting game. It was always a dream. You talk about imagination, you talk about like, kind of listening to the Holy Spirit and kind of dialing into his leading. Coffee roasting was always a dream that I'd had. And I think about it. I was in ministry working for a church in Northern Michigan back. My daughter was born in 2015, December 2015. And so we had just gone to Northern Michigan to work at church, and I was doing outreach and international mission travel, short-term mission travel for them. And, my wife and I then had this vision of opening a roasting company locally that would do a lot of these things that we're doing as far as direct trade to help producers around the world. But then also kind of the focus was more like local ministry, and how do we kind of at the high end of the wage bracket help people that are graduating from rescue missions and recovery homes, and providing work opportunities for that. So that was in the back of my mind at one point. And then a few years later, I was flying back from Port-au-Prince, Haiti, after leading a short-term mission team, and was writing in a journal about Haitian coffee and kind of this other untapped coffee source. If Haiti can ever calm down and it become kind of a viable market and place to travel for sustained ministry work, it'll be amazing.
Yeah.
A lot of the same kind of tasting profile that Southeast Asian coffee has in some ways. I really like Haitian coffee. It's kind of got that Blue Mountain Jamaican-esque feel, but different in some ways. And if you get it done really, like if you find someone that really knows how to roast it, and you can find some decent roasters in country, I think like campfire, toasted marshmallow notes kind of come out. So I'm kind of like waxing romantically about tasting profiles of this coffee bean flying back from Port-au-Prince. And, looking back through my notebook after the fact, it's like kind of all of the outline for Cisterna Coffee Company kind of came out of that. And it was another 3 years, and we're downtown Chiang Rai, Thailand, in northern Thailand. These opportunities are now like available, and it's like, okay, like, is this what we were really talking about 3 years ago and we didn't realize it? And now what do? We step through the door. Do we go into Narnia and take the risk kind of?
Right.
And we did, and it's been a wild ride since then. As we kind of develop, learn on the fly. Again, my background is nonprofit fundraising and not international importing. So there's a pretty steep learning curve of all of that. But our model kind of from the beginning, as we kind of started Cisterna, has been direct trade relationships. And in our conversation, Randy, when we were together last, really helped me kind of hone in on the why behind that, not fair trade, but honing in on direct trade and building relationships with individual suppliers, knowing where your coffee comes from and knowing the impact. And so for us, part of it is how much impact or maximizing our impact just by how we source, but also then having that funding go back into ministry opportunities. And big picture, hopefully one day the system works kind of where Beehive Global Collective and Cisterna work in tandem, where if you're buying coffee from Southeast Asia, it's funding ministry in Southeast Asia. That's not going to always be the case, but
right.
I'm in and out of these countries around the world, and most of them are coffee producing.
Well, and it's kind of crazy that some of the countries that you're highlighting here are not coffees, and they're not countries that you see very often associated with coffee. I mean, we have our Colombians and our Brazils and our Guatemalans and our Hondurans and so forth, but when you told me that you guys were going over to Thailand to source coffee, I was like, is there coffee in Thailand? And even Haiti, I mean, that the DR has coffee and there's some export of that, but knowing especially the poverty level in Haiti, and then also the ways that historically the land has been treated and really depleted the whole area of coffee, and so that's actually been one of the bigger factors in not the bigger, but one big factor in their poverty position. And so we kind of just write that off as like, oh well, that's just not a thing, and I think what you guys are doing is an encouragement to, especially for people that are involved in the coffee world, but I think this can extend to any trade, organization or mission, is to look into some of the smaller places, to look into the smaller farms, look into the places that aren't easy to get to. We did this past year where we went down to Puerto Rico, and it was the same thing where it was like, I mean, we visited a coffee farm out there, and I mean, the area is beautiful, but I'm like, I don't think I've ever seen Puerto Rican coffee here in the States. Right. And why not? And a lot of it is very much connected to poverty. And so I think that this provides a good avenue for those that are in the coffee industry and that are entrepreneurial in the coffee industry to look to those places for rehabilitation work, restorative work.
Totally. And it is sort of like, at that point, it is sort of like, what are these hidden gems and what can we find, and so, I mean, peek behind the curtain and no promises made, but some of the things that we have on our radar, Timor-Leste down in the kind of the Sumatran Islands is coffee producing. We've got some hopeful missionary contacts down there, and some hopeful maybe contacts in Myanmar. I've been able to go to a coffee producing area